Eamon Dillon, a journalist with Crime World podcast.
Great. So tell me about your reporting and how long you have been reporting on this so-called traveling conman fraud.
I've been writing about the traveling conmen fraudsters, I'd say, for well over 20 years at this stage. They've been quite a phenomenon in Ireland and in the UK for several years. And we've kind of watched them as they've kind of spread their wings and gone abroad, working further into continental Europe, into Australia, Canada, and of course the US.
And what is their tactics like when you're seeing them in Europe, across the US? What are their tactics like?
Their tactics are the exact same no matter what country they go to. Their method of operation is very simple. They'll knock on a door. They'll sound very plausible. They'll be offering whatever kind of work they think you need, whether it's for your driveway repair, your roof repair, and they'll have an excuse while they're in the area, and they just happen to spot that you might be in need of this service. And then once they get their hooks into you, the price goes up. There's more demands for money, and they can mix the charming with the threatening and intimidating, and they'll keep coming back until the well is dry.
And how much money can they get from people who are unassuming to what they're doing? They're fraud.
Well, we know from frauds that where we've kind of seen some of the investigation from police in various countries, it's anything from a couple of $100 or the equivalent of a couple of $100 right up to millions, where people have been fleeced consistently over a number of years, where they've kept going back, and you're getting well into six-figure sums, and they could have 10 or 12 of these victims on the go, so to speak, for a whole year, going back and forth to different people, pretending they need more work. We have to bring in new specialists, and they just keep going and going until they're either caught or they realize there's no money left.
And you talked about the family dynamics that these traveling con men have. Will you talk about what that's like for families in Ireland and then kind of spread across to continue this type of fraud?
It's very much a family-based criminal organization. Like the FBI refer to them as what we're calling them here tonight, or sorry, the FBI referred to them the FBI referred to them as the traveling fraud conmen group, and they describe it as a non-centralized organization, which is very true. So they actually work in small family groups. You might have two or three brothers, or a brother and a cousin, and maybe a father with the guys if they're a bit younger, but you'd never have more than two or three or four members of the same family working together. And they would hire day laborers to do a lot of the dirty work, the digging and the climbing up ladders and going across roofs. They try not to break a sweat if they can. And they work very independently. They're in independent cells, even different cells that would be kind of closely related to one another. They play their cards close to their chest. They wouldn't necessarily want to give the other guys a tip off that they're onto a rich vein of fraud money. So they kind of keep it to themselves. And then this is replicated among a number of wider clans who would have no contact whatsoever with each other, but there might be, some informal sharing of information, over the years at weddings and funerals where people will end up meeting, and there might be a bit of swapping of information, like, oh, that time I was in Rhode Island, or that time I was in Boston, or whatever, we did really well. You should try there next time you go. It could be as simple as that. But in terms of like a classic, bad guy gang that you see in Hollywood on the TV, there isn't a big Don at the top directing all this. They're all kind of separate, independent operatives who are very effective, all doing the same thing, and they're really prolific. They will go out and work and work and work, as they put it, every single day. They won't stop knocking on doors until they get some money, and they'll just get up and do it again the next day.
And you had mentioned that some of these young boys are being raised at a very young age to learn how to do this. Some might not even be going to school.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've seen again over the last 2.5 decades. Some of these kids are very young. I mean, you're talking even from the age of 8 or 9. They're on the road with the family groups. They're not necessarily attached to any particular town or community. Their community is the people they know on the road, and what they learn is what they're watching every day. They're at their daddy's elbow, so to speak, and they're listening to what's going on. They're listening to the guys on the phone. They're at the doorway sometimes when people are knocking on doors. You have some of these guys as young teenagers can sell tarmac and they can sell landscaping jobs in multiple languages across Europe. I mean, the same guys can knock on doors in Spain and in passable Spanish, trick somebody into getting their driveway done, and they can do the same thing in Swedish, in Polish, in Italian, and French. And for them to go to the States is just it's probably a bit easier because they speak English, that's their mother tongue, and they're going to be they come across as charming. They're good at personal kind of relationships. They're good at one-to-one, and they've been doing it and witnessing it since they were such a young age. By the time some unfortunate American householder meets these guys at the age of, they might think he's a young kid, he's only 22 or 24. They're already really accomplished con artists at that stage.
And from your experience, how are these people coming into the US? How are they staying? What are their operations like when they're here?
The way they get into the States, I think, is mixed. That definitely some of them for the first time, they'll go on the TV. Sorry, some of them for the first time will go on the waiver scheme. You come in as a tourist and you got your 90 days. They'll be dressed like tourists. They'll have plenty of money. They'll look like they're going home. They'll have suitcases. They probably will book to a tourist resort like Orlando, or they're going to New York to do the usual tourist stuff, and then they just stay on. They'll be able to fund themselves in terms of setting up, buying trucks, setting up websites, or get flyers printed so they can start drumming up business, knocking on doors, making it look like they're a legitimate landscaping firm or stonemasonry firm or whatever kind of business that they think people are going to fall for, where they can get their hooks in it. But in terms of like illegal crossings, there's a big element of that as well. Like we know for a fact that there's been, I think one ring managed to get 30, what they think were 30 Irish people linked to the traveling fraud group. They'd have a mixture of English and Irish passports, and they came across upstate New York, across the frozen Canadian border in October, November, December, and some of them even with small children were doing that. We know of one guy who was, I think, detained by border officials in Texas and was given an ankle bracelet to monitor him. And then he was later arrested in Miami trying to pay off a boat person to collect a bunch of people related to him from Bimini Island, which is part of the Bahamas, because they were trying to get into Miami. So it gives you an idea that whatever way they can do it, they'll do it. And, money often isn't an object. And if they feel that they're getting targeted in JFK, they'll switch. They'll find another airport. They'll fly to Australia and come in that direction, or they'll find another way of getting in. They'll always look for the weak point and exploit it.
Since you've been reporting on this for 20 years, why is it all of a sudden now that we're hearing of this traveling con man fraud? Is it because they can just pick up and leave so quickly that they're really hard for authorities to get?
I, I, I think it's been going on for years. I think the fact that people are picking up on it. There's been a number of reports in the United States, certainly over the last 2 or 3 years. There's probably a dozen or so people who've been, that we know of, that have made kind of press releases, and it's been sent up by local attorneys and by the U.S. authorities, and so we've got to know about some of these cases. But they've been at it for years. They've been at it for 20, 30 years for sure. A lot of people like that I would deal with in that community who are able to tell me that there's different members, different people they know have been working in the States for a long time, but they've gone under the radar. The fact that the FBI designated them this as an organized crime group, possibly elevates, the seriousness of what they're doing. So law enforcement are probably more interested in getting involved, or realize it's just not a one-off where you've got a rogue builder, construction worker who's ripped off a couple of people and he's probably not going to do it again. Now they know that this is part of a systematic, ongoing and prolific criminal gang that are working all the time. So all of a sudden, there's a good reason to go after these guys because they're not small time. When you add up all these small crimes, like some of these guys are generating $250,000 a week, I've no doubt.
Wow. Will you touch on how they're able to continue their fraud so diligently just by the legitimacy of like how their website looks, them changing their names, different businesses? Just describe what that looks like.
Sorry, just say that again.
Oh, no, it's okay. Um, will you talk about how they make their business seem legitimate, how they change their names, how they pick up and move? Just kind of describe why they can fly under the radar.
When they set up their firms and their landscaping business, or driveway business, or roofing, whatever it is, they will come across as if they're locally based tradespeople that who know what they're doing. That they'll kind of give the impression that they have a local kind of history. Like when they set up a company, they'll use a local place name, and they'll always attach it with some kind of sense of these guys have been around a long time. It'll give the idea of, for lack of a better phrase, a blue chip company. Because people, it's so hard. Any householder will tell you, if you're looking for a plumber or an electrician, it's so difficult to get someone, and for someone to carry out a job and do a good job in it, and one that you can afford. People are always, trying to Google, or they're trying to research, somebody who can do a job for them online, and these guys are just waiting for some of that low hanging fruit to come their way, and they go at it then. And the fact that they can set up in, for instance, like in Rhode Island, the same guys, I've no doubt, have are operating in New Jersey, they're operating in Connecticut, Massachusetts, wherever they need to go. I'm sure they've gone even further afield than that. I mean, you're talking about guys who've probably worked right across Europe at some stage. So I mean, for them, getting in a vehicle and traveling 800 or 900 miles to start again the next day is no big deal. I mean, they will go with the money roll in their pocket and start again. And even sometimes you wonder, like, some of these guys, they make so much money and they do very little with it. They almost spend it all to continue the fraud. To some extent, they'll drive in nice cars and they might stay in hotels. They might buy some jewelry, and that's possibly one method of their money laundering to some extent, is, say, to buy an expensive Rolex and then have one of the women in the family, to fly home wearing the jewelry as if it's hers. And that'll get some cash back into Ireland or into England. And that usually goes into kind of a house, which aren't necessarily in, upmarket areas. And they'll spend a lot of money, like, a couple of $100,000 on making a nice house, which they almost never live in. And, and it's almost like a symbol of their wealth and success to other members of their community. Look what we've been doing where we've been away. We haven't been wasting our money. Look at this fabulous house that we don't live in, which is a kind of a, it's hard for people not part of that community to understand that. But that's, one of the motivations that they have is to win these trophies. And the others are, the really big wedding for a daughter, or a really big funeral for a family member, where hundreds of thousands will be spent on, grave memorials, or hundreds of thousands on sequin dresses, made by designers. And again, it's about waving the cash, showing who's the big dog on the block, who's barked the loudest, is making the most money. And they can often be penniless, like, a week later. I mean, there's guys who have walked away from $200,000 Mercedes-Benz in the Swiss Alps because they realized the cops were after them, and the quickest way to get into France was to get out of the car and run down the slope. And that happened. So, I mean, there's, these guys are just, money in a way is just a prize it's just to kind of show you've been successful. And, and the fact that it's gone in your hand, it's gone from your hand 2 days later, doesn't matter. You want it. So, that's what counts.
Wow. Will you talk about prominent cases that you've heard of in the United States in the last few years? Is there some things that's come out and stick out to you in your mind?
Well, the most recent one, which I think is the reason why we're in touch, of course, was John O'Brien, who's facing charges now over his alleged scam. I think the numbers involved are quite large. It's alleged it's $1.2 million or something to that effect. You would have had Elijah Gavin, who kind of made the headlines again in Rhode Island. Not that Sorry, you had Elijah Gavin as well, who would have made the headlines not that long ago, also in Rhode Island. And and this is a guy who has a record of taking money off vulnerable people, and he also has violent convictions for violence in Northern Ireland as well. Of course, then you have people like, say, the Boswells, Oliver Boswell and his wife Kathleen. They were picked up by the U.S. authorities in July 2024, and they were wanted in the UK, where they were convicted in their absence of several counts of fraud worth up to €3 million. And they've been since extradited back to Ireland and then extradited from Ireland to the UK as well. So that was an ongoing legal battle there. There was a guy called AJ Osher from upstate New York who was recently he accepted a plea deal, and he was one of these guys that was involved in bringing over members of the traveling fraud group into the US. And again, you had Pat and Matthew McDonough, and they're from the county of Fermanagh in Ireland, and they were caught in Seattle, $435,000 worth of fraud. They got 18-month sentences for that. You had James Sherlock in December last year. This is a kid who was, I think he's quite young, only 20, 21, and bounced a check from a landscaping company buying a Rolex watch for several $1,000s. But, he was a return customer. So I think the watch dealer thought, this is okay to do business this way. There's another case as well of a people smuggler in upstate New York in October 2024 as well. You have cases in Ontario, in Toronto. I know you've also had James Dinnigan and Martin Mon in March 25 as well, and they're accused of a $1.4 million fraud as well, very similar to the one with John O'Brien. So, I mean, you have quite a few, and that's in the relatively recent past. I mean, there have been others. And I think the fact that, a lot of this stuff used to just go under the radar because, I suppose the federal authorities or national, law enforcement agencies weren't involved. But now that they are, I think we're going to see a lot more of it. We're going to see a lot more of these guys being brought to justice and facing charges and being deported from the US.